So thank you again for coming to my talk. We're going to be talking a little bit about how we all know that you have to talk about security in different ways with different people. And I'm going to kind of go over some of the adjustments that we have to make, some of the adjustments in how we think is the best security practices and how you make sure that you're reaching the audience. I have no idea why the slides aren't coming up yet, but I'm going to just kind of go through. The title of the talk is Get on the Eye Level, Tailoring the Security Talk. And the Get on the Eye Level, it's actually something that's from my psychology background. The idea is when you're trying to make a connection with a person, you physically get down on their level. So if you're taller than a person, you lower yourself, you get down so that you're eye level. I'm short, so I wear heels, or I walk around, I try to sit down. So the idea here really is that when we're talking about security, it's not just the physical connection we're trying to make, but also you're trying to appeal to their desire to do the right thing. So let's get started. I'm Fahmida Y Rashid. I'm the senior managing editor of Decipher. If you haven't heard from us, it's okay. We're brand new. It's a new publication that launched in March about democratizing security, explaining security without any fear. And if you have heard of us, thank you so much. We are so glad to have people reading us. But I've been writing about security, networking, and IT for the last 13 years, so I actually do have a lot of familiarity with some of the challenges, some of the big issues that's in the industry. Prior to becoming a journalist, though, I actually spent 10 years as a software developer and an IT admin for a large university. So I kind of know, again, how to talk to different people. That's been my job for like the last 20 years or so in figuring out how you make your case resonate with the person you're listening to. But here's the thing. I'm not just a journalist. I'm not just a tech geek. I'm also part of a family. I'm part of a community. I'm also part of a company. And because of that, my job seems to just come with me. I just bring up security and I start talking about it at the most random occasions. One of my closest friends is here, actually, and I sometimes pick up the phone. I start yelling at her, "Why do you not have a passcode?" So for me, talking about security is something I'm very natural about doing. I seem to do it without thinking. I'm hoping I'm not the only one. I'm sure all of you have had situations where you see someone doing something and say, "Hey, you shouldn't be doing it that way." So once I realized that this is something I'm doing on my own anyway, I started reaching out to different groups, community groups, public libraries, schools, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts. I started reaching out to professional organizations, being like, "Hi, if you want someone to talk about security awareness, I'm willing to stand in front of your group and talk about it." Now, when I was thinking about this, I'll admit it, I had some really, really unrealistic expectations. I figured, hey, we all know that these are the things you have to do. You just find like the right way to talk about it, and boom, you're good to go. Started out with a Thanksgiving lecture. I have a large family. I basically held back the pumpkin pie while I gave everyone a lecture on password security. It's amazing how people will listen if they want that dessert. But then it's like, all right, I can't keep doing Thanksgiving every year. It's a little bit stressful. So that's when I started talking with different groups. That's just stock photos. When I first started talking to people, I never thought I would turn it into a talk, so I didn't take any pictures, unfortunately. But I started talking with all kinds of people, some kids, some older adults, my parents' generation, people my generation who are bankers, who are technical people, like engineers, like civil engineers, aeronautics engineers, and then just local mixed group. We'll just put up flyers and say, "Hey, come, we can learn about security," and I'd get a whole range of ages. So again, you're kind of in a situation where you have to make sure that whatever you're saying, you're not getting only one segment of the population, that you're hitting all the others. And I'm going to kind of give a little bit of a commercial for Decipher for a moment here. We launched Decipher because we said we were tired of security being talked about by scaring people half to death. And when I was doing these security awareness conversations, I realized the same thing, that I can't be standing up there and say, "Hey, you need to protect your account or your bank account's going to get hacked." That's not going to work. So I needed to think about, so I wrote here, it's about finding the right examples but picking topics that are relevant to how people are interacting with the technology. And I want you to kind of remember that, think about it, because we're going to be revisiting this repeatedly. This is kind of like the central theme of my talk. And so as I mentioned, we're talking about a whole different type of groups. And I tended to focus on these three major areas, depending on age, depending on what the people were asking for. I might talk a little bit about being safe online, protecting your data, what data collection really means, what it means when you're filling out that form to join that contest to get a cruise maybe, just the idea of what it means to protect your password, what two-factor authentication is, so just a lot of that basic authentication lessons. And then I also did just what I would call broad security awareness. I mean, it's sometimes really hard when you're reading about, oh, there's an attack on the electric grid, there's an attack against the bank. What did that actually mean? So I would sometimes do just a glossary session where I have people, hey, give me a word and I'll help define it. I'll talk about what it means in relation to what they're encountering. And even right here, I realized that it wasn't enough just to be thinking InfoSec person, non-InfoSec person, business person, non-business. Like, that was kind of the mindset I was in because as a journalist, I've been writing for so many different audiences. I was used to that. And I realized even that's too broad. When you're talking one-on-one with a person, you needed to get even more specific. It wasn't just adult versus kids. It was adults who use this kind of social media site. They have a totally different set of concerns than an adult who is only using the computer in their house for checking email and surfing the web and maybe looking at their grandchildren's photos. So just the fact that we have to understand what the people's use case was very important. And it's kind of hard to do that when you're just saying, hey, I'm going to come to your group and talk about it. But that's where I realized just having conversations beforehand with the organizers saying, all right, tell me more about your group. Tell me how old some of the people are. It helped. Didn't always work, especially if I was going through a public library. Gotta say, library is amazing. Librarians are the most amazing rock stars in the world. But then you're kind of stuck in, you have no idea who's showing up that day. So I basically came with a whole list of caveats and conditions, and I'll just go through it as part of the talk. But one thing I realized is when we're talking about online privacy, when we say, hey, watch what you share, it becomes really, really hard for a lot of people I'm talking to when the entire point of their being on Facebook is because they want to share photos. Or if their job is they have to share information, they're collecting people's entry forms. So again, just saying, hey, this is the thing you should do, is making things a barrier. When I'm trying to talk to them, they're just like, you don't understand what I need. You don't understand what I want to do. And I had to continuously remind myself. So not everybody reacts to the security conversation the same way. And it kind of points out to me, again, as a journalist, this is like a duh, of course. I should have realized it. But I'll be honest, I didn't. I actually didn't think about how everybody has different threat models. Now, I have three main questions that I start asking myself. Is the example relevant? Is the problem being described something I care about? And is the advice realistic? And I'll give you an example. I was speaking with a group of middle school kids. It was sort of an after-school tech club that they had, and I came in and we were talking. And we were talking about passwords, and we were talking about how you should be careful and have good, strong passwords. And I kind of went on autopilot and started talking about password managers and two-factor authentication. And then I stopped. I looked at the kids in front of me. There were about 20 of them. 15 of them had a phone. 5 didn't. So me saying, hey, you need to turn on two-factor authentication and just use your phone and get your code, didn't apply to those 5. And it even made me feel even worse, even dumber, when I realized out of that 5 was my own son. Like, I hadn't given him a phone, and I'm standing there saying, oh, you need to turn on two-factor authentication. So that was a humbling moment, realizing that, hey, the advice that we talk about, the things that we say, oh, yeah, security best practices, aren't best practices for everyone. Another example was, again, with the same group. I was talking about how there have been studies where people just drop USB sticks in the parking lot, and they saw how many people picked it up, and they were like, no, 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 you don't put USB sticks in the computer. And all the kids, almost in unison, turned around and looked at their advisor. Because you know what? When you're in school and you're using school computers, you take your USB stick out, you put it in, you take your file, you bring it home, you're using it everywhere. So my advice had relevance if you're working in a company and you know that you're supposed to be careful, but had absolutely no bearing on these group of kids. Or kind of going back, I was at a library, and it was mainly, I would say it was basically sort of my age group. They all had young kids, they all had parents that they were being IT support for. And we were talking about, okay, make sure that you're not accepting links, that you're not opening attachments from people you don't know about. And then I stopped for a second. I said, hey, wait a minute, I'm a journalist. My entire job is to get information from people I've never heard of. There's HR and recruiters whose sole job is communicating with people they've never spoken to. So me saying, hey, don't click on links if you get an email, don't open attachments, was already cutting out a group of people. So then I stood there and I said, all right, people, work with me here. What do we do? What do we say instead of saying open up links, or don't click on links, don't open up attachments? And we started kind of people like, well, okay, I guess if it's somebody I know, I can call them, I can text them, be like, is this okay? For a lot of people, they were saying, well, I mean, if I'm on the library computer, do I really care if I end up opening a malware attachment? Let me tell you, the librarian cared. But again, so that's when we started talking about, okay, what do we need to have? What do we need to do as support? And that spurred a whole different conversation, which we wouldn't have normally had if I stayed with the dogmatic, don't open attachment, don't click on links. And kind of going back to the entire idea of, is this problem something I care about? If I am talking to someone and saying, hey, you need to make sure that you're selecting a proper user account, username, and you're not giving out your personal information online, again, the kind of people I'm talking to, that advice sounds different. For younger kids, there was a group of second graders at this point. They love being online. They love going to pbs.org. They love going to Nick Jr., and they love just surfing the web and doing stuff. A lot of them had accounts on Minecraft and Musically, and there's all these other accounts where they're basically doing stuff. Scratch was another one where they were doing coding projects. And I said, hey, what username do you use? Most of us tend to do first name dot last name or some combination. And we said, yeah, if you're a kid, you might not want to do that. So a little girl, she said, okay, my cat is Muffy. I love Muffy. That's my username. And I'm like, yeah, but do you really want somebody knowing that you have a cat named Muffy? She, at the time, 7 years old, she couldn't understand why I'm asking her that. She's like, yeah, who cares? It's my cat. What's anybody going to do with it? So I was just like, all right, you're 7, I'm going to let it pass. I asked her mom. I said, hey, how would you feel if your daughter had I love Muffy? And the mom's like, I don't see what the problem is. And I said, do you know what a security question is? She said, yeah. And I was like, what's the most common security question? What's the name of your pet? And I said, okay, if you're not thinking about what username you're using, you're suddenly giving someone a chance to get your account. So again, that started a whole conversation because it's not something that they were thinking about. And it's these kind of conversations where we're talking about account compromise, people doing bad things, and that's not always relevant to people. People are just like, well, why do they care about what I'm doing? So a lot of times when I hit those moments, I said, you know what, let's still talk about privacy. let's talk about privacy of your information and your safety, as opposed to the nebulous idea of what can someone do with an account. Because you know what, for kids, they don't have bank accounts. They don't have a lot of accounts other than like say Scratch or Minecraft. They're not seeing it, but the parents do. But the second I start saying, hey, that person over there who's saying they love Minecraft and they're 15 years old from Seattle, doesn't necessarily mean they're 15 years old and they're from Seattle. And the first question I get is, people lie? Yes, people lie. But just understanding that these are the conversations that we need to be having and making it realistic to people who are listening, because otherwise, talking about the big, broad issues really doesn't help. Now, this was probably my most interesting experience because I was speaking with an engineering group. So a lot of the time with professional engineering organizations, they have to do continuing education classes in order to maintain their license. And this local group, it's like civil engineers, mechanical, electrical, computer, aeronautics, all these people who keep the planes flying, the bridges going, the cars. And they came to me and said, we want you to do a security talk. And I'm saying, these are the smarter people. What can I possibly talk about that they don't already know and would actually qualify for their CE credits? And I'm just sitting here like, okay, maybe I'll talk about the Bangladesh bank and the SWIFT attack and why SWIFT is now doing the special guidelines for banks. Figured, okay, technical enough, I have enough detail from BAE systems, I can probably do that. And while I'm putting through that, I had a conversation with the person who invited me. And he said, if banks and governments are getting hacked, what hope is there for the rest of us? And I suddenly realized that, again, I was making the mistake of assuming a certain baseline. A lot of the times when we are seeing attacks, when you're in the industry, you're like, what do you mean you didn't have two-factor authentication? What do you mean you're reusing passwords? And I realized, hey, these people in this group, they're brilliant. But the baseline that I was assuming is not necessarily what they had. So I decided, you know what? Forget the SWIFT attack. It was a very fascinating way of how everything happened, but maybe I'll talk a little bit about passwords. And that's why I decided to have a password party. And I got to give a shout out to Jessie Irwin of Tendermint. A lot of the ideas came from just listening to her talk about how she'd been doing security awareness with a lot of people, and it's really helpful. If you don't follow her on Twitter, follow her. She's always talking great stuff about how to engage with people who are not immersed in security the way we are. And so during that talk, I had about 40 engineers. They were all significantly older than me. So I come from South Asia, which means every person older than you is either Uncle G or Auntie G. So I'm standing there like, okay, Uncle G, I'm going to have to talk to you about security. And you have to really listen to me because this is important. The most intimidating thing I'd ever done, but it was so great because they were sitting down. So I was able to do the whole getting down and doing the eye contact thing. But so we started talking about threat models. We're like, all right, what is the danger of getting a password stolen? And people are just like, oh yeah, so they're going to find out what I wrote to my mom last week. They're going to see my shopping list. And it's like, oh, all right, let's talk about what you use those email accounts for. What other email accounts become your login? And that's when they started getting it. They're saying, oh, well, I use my work account to log into that. I don't use my personal account. And I'm saying, yeah, did you just expose your employer? And again, you have light bulb moments. And so once we started kind of going on a path of what can happen with the stolen password, they got it. And then we talked about password managers. We talked about the fact that, you don't want to have the same password, but it's so hard to remember all of them. I mean, I don't know about you. I have about 30 accounts that I use on a very regular basis, and there's no way I can remember any of them. So we talked about password managers, pointed out that just because you have a strong password doesn't mean that the brute force attack might not be able to get it. I have to tell you, I got so many people telling me, but I use foreign languages, so I'm safe. I'm saying, yeah, sorry, not all hackers are English speaking. They do speak other languages, so that popular song that you're using, that lyric, they might notice. So then we started talking about multi-factor authentication, and this is where I actually made a mistake in that talk, because I started talking about the pros and cons of which scheme to use. Now, when you're doing these, be as hyper-focused as possible, because it's so easy to go down a rabbit hole and then you run out of time and you're just like, great. But we talked about the different types. We talked about phones. We talked about YubiKeys. It helped that a lot of the people in the audience were ex-government, so they all had the RSA hardware token, so they kind of had an idea of what we were talking about. But they hadn't realized you could do that for your own personal account, that there are ways to do two-factor authentication for personal accounts. So again, we started talking about that. And then the most important part was actually talking about where to enable the second factor. Because no matter what we would like, not every account has support for two-factor right now. And some accounts offer multiple ones. Which one do you use? Which one makes sense? So then we went right back to the threat model. All right, which is the one that if this gets ever compromised, you're completely going to be heartbroken and your life is over. Let's go ahead and make sure we have a very strong two-factor for it. And we kind of talked a little bit about that. I had a lot of, why can't I just use my fingerprint like I do on my phone? The first thing I did, I gave them a round of applause that somebody had actually turned on fingerprint lock on their phone. And then we started talking about just doing the screen lock. So we talked about how it doesn't always have to slow you down. It doesn't always have to make you say, this is too complicated. I need to just use it. So once we started doing that, I was getting more and more feedback. They were just like, okay, we can talk about it. I was lucky for that session. I actually had time. So we sat down and we just kind of went around and we helped people set it up. Because I think that part gets missed in a lot of the security awareness conversation, in that we talk about these are the things you should do. We give people homework, go home and download this password manager or create an account, do it. But if you can do it with the person right there, it's extremely helpful. Because then oh, so this isn't something really complicated that I'll do later. I can do it right now and I already have it. So just taking that time. So one thing I realized with this group, having less time doing the theory and the conversation and spending more time on the actual implementation made a huge difference. I happened to have a couple YubiKeys in my pocket, so we did like trivia, and whoever got it right, I threw a YubiKey, they got one. The others were kind of jealous, so they were like, I'm gonna go get my own YubiKey now. So the spirit of competition is a great way to get security conversations going. But one of the things I realized as we go and we start talking to different people, different groups, that there's a lot of prep work involved. It's not just a matter of knowing security well enough. And these are some of the questions I started thinking in terms of preparing for the talk, reaching out to the initial person, saying, hey, I'm gonna do this talk. And the first thing is, what tools, app, and technology do you think the people who are gonna be coming to the talk use? This is a great way to find out, like, okay, are most of the people who are gonna be, the ones who are always doing everything, their lives are entirely on their phones? Okay. That's a different conversation than someone who probably had an old laptop that they inherited from a different family member. Or it's, again, a totally different conversation from someone who primarily does everything when they're at work. So just understanding what kind of stuff they do. Again, this is actually another important part. Make sure your examples reflect the sites they access. Talking to someone of my generation about Snapchat is a hit and miss. Talking to a teenager about Snapchat, they're gonna be like, okay, yeah, what do I do to make sure my Snapchat is okay? The reverse, you talk about Yahoo or AOL to a younger generation, they're gonna say, what's that? I use Gmail. But then there's a lot of people on the other side of the age spectrum who still use the entire Yahoo portal to get their mail and get their news. So you have to know which site to use. When I first started doing this, I had no idea what Musical.ly was, and apparently Musical.ly just got shut down, so it no longer exists. But the kids would raise their hand and say, hey, I use Musical.ly, is that okay? And I had to quickly sit there and be like, what the heck is this? Oh, okay, it's an app where you share music videos. All right, let's talk about it. So just trying to do a lot of the homework beforehand to kind of get a feel for what example sites you can use, what apps you can use, makes a huge difference in making the initial connection. Because when you're making that initial connection, if you don't get them that first time that, oh, okay, you're going to give me something useful, you've lost them. And it's really, really hard to get them back. Sometimes I manage, sometimes I don't. But the second one is a question I ask myself. Am I going to talk about privacy? Or am I going to talk about security? Now, if you're in the industry, we know that the two are intertwined, that you need both. You have to have privacy to have security, you have to have security to have privacy. But for a lot of people, when you try to have that conversation, it becomes really overwhelming. It becomes really much like, okay, wait, am I talking about my personal information now, or am I talking about my phone? Like, which one is it? Saying both doesn't actually help. So I actually sit there, again, try to think about what sites I'm going to be using examples, what tools I'm going to be talking about, and I start thinking, hey, okay, am I going to focus more on sharing information online? What kind of information can be collected by you? Or am I going to focus more on, hey, make sure your passwords are secure? Am I going to make sure that you're putting strong passwords, what complicated passwords mean? So you kind of have to make that decision. During the talk, you can still reference the other, but one should be the primary focus over the other. And then the third question that you kind of want to ask yourself is, what are they doing with the technology? Because kind of going back to the original point I made, where telling people don't share information about yourself, don't post pictures or selfies, it's kind of pointless if the entire reason they downloaded that app or they downloaded that, they're going to that site specifically so that they can share. So you have to understand, like, what is it that they're hoping to do, and then meet them halfway. So Facebook, if they're specifically on Facebook so that they can post pictures, talk to them about the different privacy settings, talk to them about what kind of settings, what it does, what it means. I'm actually always surprised at the fact that people who are like, yeah, I totally know, make sure that I change the setting from public to friends, I'm good, it's fine. And I'm saying, yeah, but do you know what happens if someone tags you? You know what happens there, that people can, like, those friends of the person that got tagged now can see it, and they don't realize that. So there's always implications of what happens that people really need to be educated. And once you know what it is they're trying to do with tech, you can teach them how to do it safely, how to do it securely. Another thing that I realized, again, when you're talking about what do they want to do with tech, if they're looking for ways to make their life easier, and you're setting like, okay, yeah, so every time you want to check this, you have to fire up your password manager, and you have to get the two-factor for your fingerprint sensor on that, and then get the code, and then type it in. All right, my fingers are extremely dry. Fingerprint sensors always mean I have to do 6, 7 times, and then I have really bad thumbs, so typing in the code always takes forever. I get frustrated. So then it's like, okay, I get it. This entire mechanism is super frustrating, super difficult. What can we do to make it easier? Now, for the most part, I generally don't recommend people writing down their password, especially not putting it on the Post-it. But if you're talking about someone who is younger, a school-age person, or even someone who is a little on the older side, having a notebook and writing it down and keeping it far away from the computer. If the kids keep passwords and then give it to mom and dad keeps it far away, that's not a terrible idea. Because again, the idea is you want to meet people where they are, not where we think they should be. And the final question that I really wanted to emphasize is, what do they need to know now? You're having this security conversation. You're going to be talking with them for, I generally time it between half hour and 45 minutes, depending on the age and the setting. You can't do everything. So what is the one thing you want them to walk away with? Do you want them to walk away with, oh, okay, I got to make sure that my password is long? Do you want them to walk away with, yeah, you know what, maybe I'm going to stop entering all those contests and then complaining that I'm getting telemarketers calling me all the time? Find out what it is that you want their key takeaway to be and emphasize that. And that's kind of like the last point, stay focused. It's really, really easy to go down a rabbit hole, get down on tangents. The most common one is when I'm doing a talk on passwords, when I'm talking about password authentication and do not reuse your password, inevitably I get someone raising their hand and say, oh, I use sign in with Google or sign in with Facebook. Is that okay? Because I'm using my password for everyone. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, do I want to go through the entire conversation about OAuth is and how you're not actually? Or should I just make a very short version and explain that, no, actually, you're not giving your password, you're just letting someone else do it. And that's a judgment call sometimes. If you think the audience will actually understand what it means to have the token being passed and back and forth, by all means, go for it. But if you think, no, this is a really, really complicated explanation, just say, hey, that's a really great question. Why don't we shelve it? I'll come back next time and we'll focus on that. Or come grab me. Don't get distracted from the main core of your conversation, because again, you have them for such a short period of time. You don't want them going away with confused what your core message was. So that's pretty much it. This kind of journey in learning how to talk to people about security took about a year. I've spoken with about 80 people to this point. I have a couple more groups coming up. I'm continuously learning, continuously refining, and I'm always kind of like, give me ideas, what did I miss? So yeah, if anyone has any questions about things that maybe I kind of had issues with, I'll be glad to answer. If you think there's something I missed, then obviously I should be talking about this with the groups I talk to. I welcome feedback. So I think you said we have microphone. So anyone else? Yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you for giving this talk. People are hard, and this is definitely a good thing to know. You covered a lot in regards to people who maybe are more removed from tech or are less in a security background, but generally speaking, those people who are students or people who came to a talk. What advice do you maybe have for talking to people who are maybe above you in a corporate ladder, or maybe incentivized in some situations to maybe put security as a secondary priority without sounding alarmist or making them shut down?
The word I use is shrill, so yeah.
And also in a way that they can still understand, because people tend to, when faced with things they don't understand, sometimes smile and nod as to not seem like they don't know, as opposed to asking for clarification. So what advice do you have for getting people who are maybe not really coming to you for this advice, but need it anyway?
So that's a really tricky situation, because you have to kind of get past that initial reluctance of, oh, why are you talking to me? I'm okay. And the first thing that I've actually kind of found that worked specifically for me was coming in and just being like, hey, so I'm right now talking about security and then I pick something that's specifically important to me. So kind of going back to the initial point about getting on eye level, I find something that I think that person might be concerned about, and then they can relate to if I say I'm concerned about it. So in the case of someone who is maybe more senior, who is someone more, the new stuff is really useful, being like, hey, so I was just reading about how this company, their CFO got an email apparently pretending to be from a CEO, and then they lost all this money. I'm kind of freaked out that this might happen to my company, that I might get an email pretending to be from you. What do you think we should do about this? The second you kind of loop the person into the what do you think we should do about it, you get that initial buy-in that you'd have normally gotten if you say, hey, come to my talk. So once you get that initial buy-in, like, yes, they don't want people thinking that he's sending out emails saying he's stranded in London and needs money. So once you have that buy-in, then you start going, again, with the same conversation that you might, but it's always, again, being like, so how do we make sure this doesn't happen to us? It's a little bit trickier because I feel like it's a more conversation. It's not as direct as, hey, so you need to do this and you need to do this. But humans being what we are, we don't like being told what to do. It took me a long time to learn that I don't like being told what to do, and that me telling someone, you got to do this, doesn't work. My kid told me that many, many times. But So it's kind of like the same way. You make that initial established connection that, yes, this is something that they care about as well, and then kind of looping them in. Like, so, okay, can we make sure that you always have a UB key so that we know that you're not doing it? And if they're like, you know what, the UB keys are a little like frustrating. What if I lose the UB key? All right, well, you have your phone with you all the time. Can we have Google Authenticators installed on it? So it becomes, again, a conversation. For someone who is more above you in rank in terms of social class, one-on-one is a little bit better because then there's less defensiveness. But if you're in a corporate situation and you're kind of doing a class for the senior management, again, just being like, hey, so we need to make sure that we're not going to be seeing emails that we don't want to, like, you know what, we don't want what happened to Sony and our personal emails being leaked. What can we do to make sure our emails are safe? So I don't want to say use the misery of other people, but it also does help being like, this is something that's happening. We know it's happening. And yeah, we all got a little bit of delight in reading some of the email that Sony executive wrote. We kind of enjoyed it, but we also don't want that to be us. And that's another strong motivator, I think. So, anyone else? So thank you again. Thank you so much. And I don't really post a lot on Twitter, but sometimes I do. If you have any questions, if you are ever kind of curious about stuff we are doing on Decipher, please follow me. Thank you.